Red light. That was the first thing I saw when the shuttle dropped out of the jump lane. Not stars. Not the shining hull of the council station. Just a wall of red light flashing across my cockpit display, and a voice in my earpiece telling me that 3 warships had locked their targeting arrays on my tiny transport before I had even finished my landing request. My name is Elena Voss, and I was the last person Earth sent to speak for our entire species. I did not move. I had trained myself for years not to move when fear tried to take my hands. I sat very still in my seat, watched the number on my threat display climb from 3 locks to 5, and I said, in the calmest voice I could find, that I was a diplomatic envoy under Council Escort Protocol, and I expected that protocol to be honored. There was a pause. A long one. Then the weapons locks dropped, one by one, and a clipped voice welcomed me to Threshold Station, home of the Galactic Council, as if nothing had happened at all. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. Then I checked the chronometer. 4 minutes. That was how long it took the most advanced civilization in the galaxy to remind me exactly where humanity stood in their eyes. Not as a guest, as a suspect. I had known this trip would be difficult. I had not expected it to start with gun barrels. The station itself was beautiful, in the cold way that things built by beings much older than you are often beautiful. Towers of pale metal rose out of a ring that circled a small artificial sun, and thousands of ships from 100 different worlds moved between them in slow, silent order. I watched it grow larger in my window and tried to remind myself why I had accepted this assignment. 17 years earlier, humanity had made first contact with an alien species by accident, when a survey drone near the edge of our system picked up a signal it was never built to understand. In the years since, we had met more species than any of us could have imagined as children. Some were curious, some were distant, a few were openly hostile, and all of them, it seemed, answered to a body called the Galactic Council, an institution that had existed long before any human had learned to read. For most of those 17 years, the Council had ignored us. We were too new, too small, too unpredictable to matter. Then, 6 weeks ago, an official summons arrived at Earth's Unified Assembly, addressed not to a president or a general, but to whoever spoke for humanity as a whole. It asked us to attend what it called peace talks. Peace talks implied a war. We had not been told we were in one. I remember the meeting where I was chosen. 12 people sat around a table in Geneva, arguing for 6 hours about who should go. Most of the arguments were really about fear. Fear of saying yes to the wrong thing. Fear of saying no to the wrong thing. In the end, they chose me, mostly because I had spent a decade working with our first alien trade partners, and had never once lost a negotiation, even when the odds were stacked against me. Nobody in that room told me what I would be walking into. I do not think they knew either. A soft chime interrupted my thoughts. My shuttle had docked. A voice welcomed me again, this time with a name attached, an officer called Renner Voss, no relation, who would guide me to the chamber. I gathered my case, straightened my jacket, and stepped out into the station. The corridor outside was full of beings I recognized only from old briefing files. Tall, slender creatures with skin like brushed silver walked past me without a glance. A group of shorter beings covered in fine blue fur spoke rapidly to each other in a language of clicks. None of them looked at me the way you look at someone new. They looked at me the way you look at a chair that has been moved into the wrong room. My escort, a human officer named Daniel Hart, fell into step beside me. He had been stationed on Threshold for 2 years, as part of our tiny observer mission, the closest thing humanity had to a permanent presence among the stars. He kept his voice low as we walked. "Something is wrong," he said. The summons came out of nowhere. No preliminary talks, no working groups, nothing. That is not how the Council does business. They plan everything years in advance. I asked him what he thought it meant. He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice had dropped even lower. "I think they already decided something," he said. "And I think they are only calling this a negotiation, because it looks better in the record." I did not have time to ask him what he meant by that, because the corridor opened into a wide hall, and at the far end of it stood 2 enormous doors, taller than any building I had stood beneath on Earth. A group of council attendants waited there, their faces unreadable behind smooth ceremonial masks. One of them stepped forward and spoke my name and my title in a flat, official tone, as though reading it from a list that did not particularly interest them. Behind those doors, I knew, sat representatives of civilizations that had been exploring the stars, while my ancestors were still learning to shape iron. Some of them had fleets larger than our entire industrial output. Some of them had memories that stretched back further than our written history. And in a matter of moments, I would be expected to sit among them and speak for every human being alive, on a world they had summoned me to, with 4 words and no explanation. I thought of the 3 human colonies out past our border, the ones we had built with our own hands over the last decade, the ones full of families who had left Earth to start something new. I thought of the reports that had been quietly filed over the past year, of unfamiliar ships appearing near those colonies, of communications that had gone unanswered, of small incidents that our government had chosen not to make public because nobody wanted to start something we could not finish. I understood, standing in that hallway, that this was not really about peace at all. Somebody wanted something from us, and they had brought me all this way to make sure they got it with the appearance of consent. Daniel touched my arm before I stepped forward. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "remember that you are allowed to say no." I did not know yet how much that sentence would matter. I only nodded, because the doors were already beginning to open, and a wave of cold, bright light spilled out into the hall to meet me. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward it, because that is what you do when there is no one behind you to walk in your place. The doors closed at my back with a sound like a held breath being released, and for a moment I stood alone at the edge of the chamber, letting my eyes adjust to a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I had seen images of the council chamber during my briefings, but no image had prepared me for the size of it. The room rose in a great curved bowl, tier after tier climbing toward a ceiling I could not see the top of, and on every tier sat delegates from worlds I had only read about in reports written by people who had never actually met them. Some had 4 eyes, some had none that I could see at all. Some sat in floating chairs filled with pale liquid, their bodies suited for environments no human could survive in for more than a few seconds. At the center of the bowl, on a raised platform meant for whoever had come to speak, stood a single podium. It looked very small from where I stood. It looked smaller still once I reached it. A translation field settled over me the moment I stepped onto the platform, a faint pressure behind my ears that told me every word I said would reach every delegate in their own language, and every word they said would reach me in mine. It was, I remember thinking, a strange kind of intimacy, to know that 1,000 strangers were about to hear my voice, as clearly as if I were speaking directly into their minds. A tall figure rose from the highest tier. His skin was a deep bronze color, patterned with fine ridges that caught the light as he moved. I recognized him from my briefing files. Ambassador Threz Van, senior representative of the Caliph Dominion, one of the oldest and most powerful members of the council. He did not greet me. He did not welcome me to the chamber, or thank me for making the journey, or offer any of the small courtesies I had been trained to expect. He simply began speaking, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of that enormous room. "The matter before this chamber," he said, "concerns 3 settlements established by the species known as humanity, within what council law defines as an unclaimed expansion zone." I felt my stomach tighten. Unclaimed expansion zone. That was the first time I had heard that phrase used to describe the space around our own colonies, space our surveys had charted, space our people had lived on for years. Threz Van continued without pause. Under Statute 11-4 of the Continuity Accord, territory within an unclaimed expansion zone that borders an established member species falls under the administrative authority of that member species, pending formal review. The Caliph Dominion has petitioned this council to recognize its authority over the 3 settlements in question, in the interest of stability and proper governance. I gripped the edges of the podium and made myself speak slowly, because I had learned long ago that the fastest way to lose an argument was to let anger reach your voice before your reasoning did. "Those settlements were built by human colonists," I said. "They have lived there for years. They have their own local governance, their own industry, their own families raising children who have never seen Earth. I would ask the ambassador to explain how a statute written before humanity ever left our solar system can be used to claim authority over people it was never designed to include." Threz Van did not look at me when he answered. He looked instead at the tiers around him, as though I were not the one he needed to convince. The statute exists precisely because young species often expand faster than they can properly defend or administer their territory, he said. This is not a punishment, it is a protection. The Dominion offers oversight, security, and access to resources far beyond what an unrecognized day species could provide for itself. A murmur passed through the chamber, though I could not tell if it was agreement or simple attention. I looked for support among the other tiers, and found none. One by one, delegates from other species rose to speak, and one by one, they echoed almost exactly what Van had said, using different words, but arriving at the same conclusion, as though they had rehearsed it together, before I ever arrived. A delegate from a species called the Vral, their bodies long and pale, their voices soft and almost musical, spoke of the importance of order in a growing galaxy. A delegate from the Southarim, hidden inside a suit of shimmering gas, spoke of precedent, citing 3 other cases where young species had accepted similar arrangements and, in their words, flourished under guidance. Even a delegate from the Ashkan Concord, a species I had been told privately were sympathetic to newer members, offered only a quiet suggestion that humanity should consider the wisdom of accepting help rather than facing the unknown alone. I stood at that podium and listened to civilization after civilization tell me, in careful and polite language, that my people's homes were not really ours to keep. When I tried to ask for evidence that the statute had ever been applied to a species with an established, functioning colony, rather than a scattered outpost, I was told that precedent was a matter for council archivists, not open debate on the chamber floor. When I asked why no preliminary discussions had taken place before this session, I was told that urgency had required a direct approach. When I pointed out that no human representative had been consulted on the drafting of Statute 11-4, a soft ripple of something that might have been amusement moved through the upper tiers, and a delegate near the back murmured, just loud enough for the translation field to catch it, that humanity was still very young, and young species were often emotional about matters better handled with patience. I felt heat rise in my face, and I made myself breathe before I spoke again. I am not here to be patient, I said. I am here to represent a species who built 3 thriving communities out of nothing, in territory no one else was using, and who deserve to be heard as equals, not managed as children. Van finally looked directly at me then. There was no anger in his expression. That was somehow worse than anger would have been. There was only a kind of distant, practiced patience, the look you might give a storm that would pass on its own if you simply waited long enough. Humanity has been a recognized species for less than 2 decades, he said. In that time you have not once been asked to contribute to the defense of this region, nor have you demonstrated the capacity to do so. The Dominion, and this Council, are simply proposing a partnership suited to your current position in the galaxy, nothing more. Then, almost as an afterthought, as though the words cost him nothing at all, he added something that would stay with me long after that session ended. Perhaps humanity's greatest value to this Council, he said, will be found not in what it can build, but in what it can absorb, standing between civilized space and whatever still waits beyond it. The chamber was silent after that. I understood, in that silence, exactly what I was standing in the middle of. This was never a negotiation. It was a formality, dressed up in the language of law, designed to make the loss of our colonies look like something we had agreed to. I did not answer him immediately. I stood at that small podium, in that vast curved room, surrounded by 1,000 eyes that had already decided what I was worth before I ever spoke a single word, and I understood that whatever I said next would matter more than anything I had said in my entire career. I asked, quietly, for the session to be paused until the following day. Van inclined his head, the barest gesture of agreement, already certain, I think, of how this would end. He had no idea how wrong he was. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the small guest quarters assigned to me on Threshold Station, staring at a window that showed only the slow drift of ships against a black sky, and I ran the conversation over and over in my mind, searching for an angle I had missed, a rule I could use, a thread I could pull that would unravel their argument. I found nothing. The Council had not brought me there to win an argument. They had brought me there to accept a decision that had already been made. Daniel came to see me before dawn, station time, carrying 2 cups of something that was almost coffee, and nothing close to good coffee. He sat across from me without speaking for a while, letting the silence settle before he finally asked what I planned to do. I told him the truth. I did not know yet. I only knew what I would not do, and that was walk back into that chamber and thank them for their generosity. He told me something then that I have never forgotten. He said that in his 2 years on the station, he had watched 4 other young species go through almost exactly what I was going through now. Each of them had come in hopeful. Each of them had left with less than they arrived with. Not because they lost an argument, he said, but because they had never been willing to lose the meeting itself. I asked him what he meant. They always try to make you afraid of walking away, he said, because once you sit down at that table, they know you need something from them more than they need anything from you. The moment you stop needing that seat, everything changes. I thought about Earth's leadership before I left, sitting around that table in Geneva, giving me discretion I had never expected to actually use. Walk if the terms are unacceptable, they had told me, as though it were a simple thing. A line in a briefing document rather than a decision that could change the course of my species' place among the stars. I thought of the families on those 3 colonies, people who had left everything they knew to build something new, who had no idea that a room full of strangers on a station none of them had ever seen was quietly deciding their future. By the time the session resumed, I had made my decision. I did not know if it was the right one. I only knew it was the only one I could live with. The chamber felt colder that second day, though I do not think the temperature had changed at all. Therese Van opened the session as though the previous day's discussion had been nothing more than a brief pause for reflection, a formality, before the inevitable conclusion. The Dominion is prepared to finalize terms, he said. Humanity will cede administrative claim over the 3 settlements in the disputed zone. In exchange, the Dominion will provide security guarantees along your border, along with limited trade access to council-regulated markets. Humanity will retain observer status within this council, with the understanding that full voting membership may be considered again in future decades, contingent on demonstrated stability. He said it all so smoothly, so reasonably, that for a moment I understood exactly how species before us had signed away pieces of themselves without ever quite realizing what they had lost. It did not sound like surrender. It sounded like generosity. I let the silence stretch after he finished speaking. I wanted every delegate in that chamber to feel it, the way you feel a held breath in a room before someone finally exhales. Then I spoke. I would like to understand one thing clearly, I said, before this council finalizes anything. The people living on those 3 settlements were not asked whether they wished to become subjects of the Caliph Dominion. They were not consulted on this arrangement in any way. Is that correct? Therese Van's expression did not change. Local consent is not a requirement under the statute in question, he said. The matter falls under interspecies jurisdiction, decided at this level. So you are telling me, I said, that a decision affecting thousands of people who have built homes, raised children, and created lives for themselves will be made entirely by beings none of them have ever met, without a single word of input from them. That is an accurate description of the process, yes, Therese Van said, and there was, for the first time, the faintest note of impatience in his voice, as though he found my persistence tedious rather than threatening. I looked around the chamber then, slowly, deliberately, letting my eyes pass over tier after tier of delegates who had already decided, before I ever walked through those doors, exactly how this session would end. I thought of every argument I had prepared, every precedent I had studied, every careful diplomatic phrase I had rehearsed on the long journey to this station. None of it mattered here. I understood that now with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. I am not going to stand here and negotiate the surrender of human lives to a body that has already made up its mind, I said. I did not come to this station to be told what my people will accept. I came here to speak for them, and I intend to do exactly that. A ripple of movement passed through the upper tiers, delegates shifting, murmuring, some leaning forward with what might have been curiosity, others sitting back with what looked distinctly like disapproval. Therese Van's voice, when he answered, had lost its earlier patience entirely. You are, of course, free to reject these terms, he said, but I would remind the envoy that humanity's position within this council, and within this region of space, depends on the goodwill of its established members. Walking away from this arrangement does not remove the underlying dispute. It simply leaves your people unprotected, while that dispute remains unresolved. That threat, dressed up as a warning, was the moment something inside me finally settled into place. I had spent 2 days being told, in 100 careful ways, that humanity was too young, too small, too emotional to be taken seriously. I had watched delegate after delegate use the language of protection to describe what was, in the plainest terms, the quiet seizure of territory that belonged to people who had done nothing wrong except build something worth taking. I thought of every human who had ever been told they were too small to matter, and had proven otherwise anyway, not through the size of their fleet or the age of their civilization, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to accept being managed by people who had never bothered to ask what they actually wanted. I straightened at the podium. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The translation field would carry every word to every corner of that chamber, and I wanted my voice to be as steady as I could make it, because I understood that the words I chose in the next few seconds would be remembered, one way or another, for a very long time. Humanity did not come to this station to be managed, I said. We came to be heard. For 2 days, we have been spoken about, spoken over, and spoken down to, by a council that summoned us here, under the name of peace talks, and then refused to treat us as a party capable of negotiating anything at all. You have made your position clear. I am now making ours equally clear. We will not sign an agreement that treats our people as territory, to be assigned, rather than citizens to be respected. If this council intends to proceed with this decision, regardless of our answer, then let the record show exactly what kind of council makes decisions that way, and let every species watching decide for themselves whether they wish to be next. I paused, letting the silence hold for one long moment before I spoke my final words. We are done being unheard. I stepped back from the podium. I did not wait for Thresvan's response. I did not wait for the murmur that was already building across the tiers, or the sound of several delegates rising from their seats, or the strange stillness that had settled over the highest levels of the chamber, where the oldest and quietest members of the council sat watching, without a single word. I turned and walked toward the great doors at the far end of the room, and with every step I took, I expected someone to call after me, to offer some final concession, some small adjustment meant to bring me back to the table. No one did. The doors opened before I reached them, as though the station itself had been waiting for this exact moment, and I walked through them without looking back. The hallway outside was empty. Daniel was not there to meet me this time. I had told him to wait elsewhere, not wanting anyone to think I had planned an audience for my exit. I walked alone through those pale corridors, past delegates from a dozen species who had not yet heard what had happened inside that chamber, and for the first time since I had arrived on Threshold Station, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. I did not know, in that moment, whether I had just secured a future for humanity among the stars, or whether I had just ended one before it had properly begun. I only knew that I could not have done anything differently, and that whatever came next, it would come because we had chosen it for ourselves, rather than had it chosen for us. By the time I reached my shuttle, my hands were shaking, quietly, the way they only ever do once the moment that required them to be steady has finally passed. I sat down in the pilot's seat and stared out at the vast, glittering shape of Threshold Station, and I wondered how long it would take before the entire galaxy knew what humanity had just done. I did not have to wonder for very long. News moves strangely across the stars. It does not travel the way it does on Earth, through screens and signals that reach everyone within seconds. It moves through relay stations and courier ships and the private channels of ambassadors who cannot resist sharing what they have seen. And yet somehow, within a single day, it seemed that every species with a presence on Threshold Station already knew what had happened inside that chamber. I felt it before I understood it. I felt it in the way beings looked at me as I walked the corridors, no longer with the polite indifference of the first day, but with something sharper, something closer to attention. A pale Vral delegate who had said almost nothing during the session inclined her head to me as I passed. A gesture I later learned was reserved for individuals who had taken a significant personal risk. A group of Sutharim, still hidden inside their shimmering suits, drew back slightly as I approached, as though uncertain whether to be near me at all. Daniel found me not long after I returned to my quarters, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked almost unsettled. "Do you understand what you did?" he asked, and it was not really a question. I told him I understood what I had said. I was not entirely sure yet what it meant. He told me that no species had walked out of a council session in over a century. Most young species who reached the point of frustration I had reached simply accepted the terms offered to them, because the alternative, refusing outright, was considered by most of the galaxy to be a kind of quiet suicide. Species that refused council terms were rarely attacked outright. They were simply left alone, cut off from trade routes, denied support, allowed to struggle against threats far larger than themselves, until they either collapsed or crawled back to accept whatever arrangement they had once rejected. I asked him if he thought that was what would happen to us. He did not answer right away. Instead, he opened a private channel on his datapad and showed me something that had been circulating quietly through the diplomatic networks over the past several hours. It was not a formal statement. It was closer to a rumor, the kind of thing whispered between aides and translated a dozen times before it ever reached someone like me. But the substance of it was clear enough. The Calith Dominion had convened an emergency session of its own government, and not every voice within it agreed on how to respond to what I had done. Meanwhile, on the other side of that same station, in a chamber far smaller and far quieter than the one I had stood in, Ambassador Threz Van sat with two of his senior aides, reviewing the recording of my final statement for what was, by his own admission, the fourth time. He did not understand it. That was the truth he would not have said aloud to anyone outside his closest circle, but it was the truth nonetheless. In all his centuries of service to the Dominion, he had negotiated with dozens of species on the edge of joining council space, and every single one of them had, eventually, understood the shape of the game they were playing. They understood that resistance was a formality, a small performance of dignity, before an inevitable agreement. They postured, they protested, and then they signed. Humanity had not signed. Humanity had simply left. One of his aides, a younger Calith named Senar, suggested that this was precisely the emotional instability they had warned the council about. Proof that humanity was unfit for full membership, unable to control its own impulses, even in matters of the greatest importance. Threz Van considered this for a long moment before he shook his head. "It was not emotional," he said finally. "That is what troubles me." She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten us. She simply decided that our terms were not worth accepting, and she left. That is not instability. That is something else. Senar asked what he meant. Threz Van was quiet for a long time before he answered. "Every species we have ever brought before this council has had a price," he said. "Something they valued more than their pride, more than their independence, more than the abstract idea of being treated as equals. Security, trade access, protection from a larger threat. We have always known exactly what to offer, because we have always known what they were afraid to lose. I do not think we know that about humanity, and a species whose price we cannot calculate is a species we cannot properly predict." That single realization, spoken quietly in a small room by a single ambassador, would prove to matter more than either of us understood at the time, because word of what I had done was not only reaching the powerful, it was reaching the small. Within 2 days, 3 separate species with minor standing in the council, species who had spent years quietly accepting unfavorable terms, rather than risk confrontation with larger powers, reached out through unofficial channels to our small observer mission. None of them wished to be identified publicly. All of them wanted to know the same thing. They wanted to know how humanity had found the courage to say no, and whether we believed it was actually possible to survive having said it. I met with representatives from one of these species myself, a quiet, careful people called the Dorith, whose delegate arrived at our mission wrapped in a traveling cloak that hid most of her features from view. She told me, through a translator our people had trained ourselves rather than one supplied by the council, that her species had accepted 3 separate territorial arrangements over the past 40 years, each one justified by the same statute Threz Van had cited to me, each one slightly reducing what remained of their independence. She asked me why humanity had chosen to fight this time, when the cost of losing seemed so high. I told her the truth. I told her that the cost of accepting felt higher. That a species which agrees to be quietly diminished, again and again, in exchange for temporary safety, eventually finds that safety was never really the thing being purchased at all. What was actually being purchased was silence. And silence, once you have sold enough of it, becomes very difficult to buy back. She left that meeting without making any promises, but I noticed, in the days that followed, that her delegation began attending council sessions with a new kind of attention, watching not just the proceedings themselves, but watching me, watching how humanity moved through a system that had never expected us to push back. The council, for its part, could not simply ignore what had happened. A formal walkout, especially one delivered with the kind of measured, public language I had used, created a problem no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could quietly erase. Other member species had heard my words. Other member species had watched, closely, to see what would happen next. If the council chose to punish humanity for refusing an unfair arrangement, it risked confirming, in front of every smaller species watching, exactly the kind of institution Threz Van had insisted it was not. If the council did nothing, it risked appearing weak, unable to enforce even its own long-standing statutes against a species with barely 2 decades of interstellar experience. I did not know all of this at the time. I only knew that our small fleet, still nowhere near the size of the powers we had just defied, began quietly repositioning near the 3 disputed colonies, not as an act of aggression, but as a clear and simple statement that we did not intend to be caught unprepared if anyone mistook our refusal for weakness. I remember standing in our mission's small communications room, watching a live feed from one of those colonies, a modest settlement built into the side of a red rock valley, its lights glowing warm against an alien sky. A woman named Grace Ellery, one of the settlement's elected representatives, appeared on the screen, her face tired but resolute, and thanked our government for standing beside them, rather than trading them away. I told her, honestly, that I did not know what would come next. I told her that we had chosen a difficult path, and that difficult paths rarely offer guarantees. She told me that was fine. She said her people had not left Earth looking for guarantees. They had left looking for the chance to build something that was truly theirs, and if humanity was finally willing to stand behind that chance rather than trade it away, then whatever came next, they were prepared to face it. I carried those words with me, back into the quiet uncertainty of the following days, as reports continued to arrive of council delegations meeting behind closed doors, weighing options that none of them shared with us directly. I did not know, standing in that small room so far from home, whether humanity had just secured a future among the stars, or simply delayed the moment when that future would be taken from us anyway. What I did know was that something had shifted, not just in how the council saw us, but in how a handful of smaller, quieter species had begun to see themselves. And in a galaxy built on centuries of careful, predictable order, that shift, small as it seemed, was enough to make even the oldest powers pause. 3 weeks passed before the second invitation arrived, and in those 3 weeks I learned more about patience than I had learned in my entire career before it. I spent the first several days expecting retaliation. I kept our small mission staff on constant alert, reviewing every incoming transmission twice, half convinced that each new signal might carry news of an attack on one of our colonies, or a formal condemnation from the council itself, or some quiet economic measure meant to remind us exactly how much we depended on systems we did not control. None of that happened. Instead, something stranger occurred. Nothing happened at all. Daniel told me this silence was, in its own way, more significant than any immediate response could have been. The council did not move quickly under normal circumstances, he explained, but this was not normal circumstances. A body that had built its authority over centuries on the quiet, orderly management of disputes, had just watched a member species reject that authority in the most public way possible, in front of dozens of delegations who would not soon forget it. Whatever the council decided to do next, it would be shaping how every other species in that chamber understood the limits of council power for a very long time. While the council deliberated, something else was happening, quietly, outside the formal channels of diplomacy. The Dorith delegate I had met in those first uncertain days after the walkout returned to our mission, this time without her traveling cloak, her features open and visible for the first time. She told me that her government, after decades of accepting council terms without protest, had voted to formally request a review of the very statute that had been used against our colonies. She admitted this was, in part, inspired by watching humanity refuse to accept the same treatment quietly. Word of the Dorith request reached 2 other minor species within days. One of them, a small trading confederation called the Ilvashi, sent a private message to our mission, simply thanking us, without elaboration, for reminding them that refusal was still a language the council understood. I began to realize, slowly, that humanity's walkout had done something none of us could have planned or predicted. It had not won us any formal victory. It had not changed a single line of council law. But it had shown 100 quiet species, watching from the margins of that vast chamber, that the appearance of council authority was not the same thing as its actual strength, and that the price of challenging it, while real, was not always as catastrophic as they had been taught to believe. The Calith Dominion, for its part, found itself in a position it had clearly never expected to occupy. Ambassador Threz Van's private assessment, the one he had shared only with his closest aides, proved more accurate than he likely wished. Humanity's refusal to behave predictably had made calculating a response extraordinarily difficult. Punishing us openly risked confirming every unflattering thing I had said in that chamber, in front of species who were now watching far more closely than they ever had before. Ignoring the matter entirely risked emboldening exactly the kind of quiet rebellion already stirring among the Dorith and the Ilvashi, and offering humanity better terms without some form of concession in return risked appearing, to the Dominion's own government back home, like a humiliating retreat. I learned much of this later, pieced together from conversations with delegates who had grown, in the weeks following the walkout, unexpectedly willing to speak with me honestly. What I understood at the time was simpler. The Council, for the first time in longer than any of its current members could recall, found itself facing a species it could not comfortably predict, and that unpredictability, more than any fleet or any resource, had become the single most disruptive factor in a system built entirely around order. The second invitation, when it finally arrived, looked nothing like the first. It did not summon me. It requested my presence, in careful, deliberate language, for what it called a bilateral summit, a term the Council rarely used with any species below full voting status. It specified that humanity would be permitted to present its own proposed terms first, before any Council response, a courtesy I later learned had almost never been extended to a probationary member in the Council's recorded history. I returned to Threshold Station 3 days later, and this time, I did not walk those corridors alone. Beside me stood a small delegation representing not only humanity, but 2 of the species who had reached out to us in the weeks since the walkout. The Dorith delegate walked at my left, her cloak finally set aside for good. A representative of the Ilvashi Confederation walked at my right, quiet and watchful, clearly still uncertain of exactly how much courage this moment required. We were not a large group. We were not, by any measure the Council typically used, a powerful one. But we walked into that chamber together, and I understood, as the great doors opened before us, that the Council could see the difference as clearly as I could. The chamber felt different this time. I do not think the room itself had changed, but I had. I no longer stood at that small podium feeling like the newest, smallest voice in a room built to remind me of exactly how little I mattered. I stood there, as someone who had already said no once, and survived it, and found, in the survival, something the Council had clearly hoped I would not find at all. Threz Van rose to open the session, and for the first time since I had met him, his opening words were not a statement of terms already decided. They were a question. "What does humanity propose?" he asked, as a resolution to this matter. I laid out our position plainly. The 3 colonies would remain under human governance, with local representatives given a direct voice in any future discussions involving their territory. Statute 11-4 would be formally reviewed, with input from the species it had most recently been used against, rather than decided solely by the powers who benefited from its broad interpretation. And any future disputes involving newer member species would include, as a matter of standing procedure, a genuine opportunity for those species to respond before terms were finalized, rather than after. I did not expect the Dominion to accept every point without resistance, and they did not. There were hours of careful, sometimes tense discussion, arguments over wording, disagreements over precedent, moments where I felt the old fear creeping back into my chest, the fear that this, too, would end the way the first session nearly had. But it was different this time, in a way I could feel even before the final vote was called. The other delegates in that chamber were not simply watching the Dominion dictate terms and waiting for humanity to accept them. They were watching how the Dominion negotiated, watching whether a species that had refused unfair terms once could actually secure fair ones. Watching, in short, whether resistance had been worth its cost. When the session finally closed, The terms were not perfect. Little in diplomacy ever is. But the 3 colonies remained ours, governed by the people who had built them, with a formal mechanism now in place for their voices to be heard in any future dispute. Statute 11-4 would be reviewed. Its future application no longer left entirely to the judgment of the powers it had always favored. And humanity, while still short of full voting membership, had secured something the Council had never before extended so early to any species in our position: a formal seat on the review committee, shaping how younger member species would be treated going forward. I sat alone in that vast chamber for a while after the session ended, long after most of the other delegates had filed out through the great doors, long after Threz Van himself had risen and departed without another word to me. I looked up at the tiers rising above me, no longer feeling small beneath them, no longer feeling like a stranger who had wandered into a room built to remind her of everything her species was not. I thought about what we had actually offered the galaxy in that first, terrifying moment, when I turned and walked away from the podium. It was not military strength. We did not have enough of that to matter to anyone in that chamber. It was not ancient wisdom, or vast resources, or technology, beyond what older species already possessed. It was something smaller than any of that, and somehow far more difficult for a civilization as old and careful as the Council to manage. It was the simple, stubborn willingness to say no, and mean it, even when saying yes would have been so much easier. I do not know what the galaxy will ask of humanity next. I do not know whether the peace we secured in that second session will hold, or whether some new crisis will test it before another decade has passed. What I do know is this: we did not walk into that first chamber as equals, and for 2 long days, I was made to feel every ounce of that difference. But we did not leave it as subjects either. We left it, in the only way that mattered, as a species the galaxy could no longer afford to ignore. And somewhere in that vast ancient chamber, among delegates who had spent centuries deciding the fate of younger worlds, without ever once imagining they might be told no, I believe something had quietly, permanently changed. Humanity had walked out, and for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the Galactic Council had learned what it felt like to tremble.